goes before us into the future, goes before us into the heavens, but he also goes before us into the promises of God in order to make them ours too. There's a story by Charles Dickens that's been made into a number of movies, one just a couple of years ago, called Great Expectations. Did you ever wonder what that title actually means? Well, back in those days, in the early 1800s, a person's inheritance were considered his expectations, what he expected to receive ultimately, what was promised him by his parents, for example. And in this story, we meet a young man who has great expectations because he learns that someone, a mysterious person, anonymous, has written him into the will, and when he turns 21, he's going to inherit all of that person's riches. His name is Pip, and Pip thinks that all of this money is coming from an elderly lady he's gotten to know in his childhood, whose name is Miss Havisham, and she is very, very wealthy, to be sure. But what Pip discovers is that this great expectations, it comes from a criminal that he had helped when he was a young boy, and this criminal now has gone on to Australia, made a lot of money, and remembers what Pip had done for him and writes Pip into his will. In other words, Pip enjoys a lot of inheritance that he had nothing to do with. Someone went before him and made it his too. That's sort of like what we read in Isaiah chapter 53. When we read, there was nothing beautiful or majestic about his appearance, speaking of Jesus, nothing to attract us to him. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows. He was beaten so we could be made whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. The Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands. And because of his experience, my righteous servant will make it possible for many to be counted righteous. I will give him the honors of a victorious soldier, and that will happen because he bore the sins of many and interceded for rebels. Sort of the same idea Paul has when he writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, that you're familiar with the generosity of our Master Jesus Christ. Rich as he was, he gave it all away for us. In one stroke, he became poor and we became rich. In other words, he gives us great expectations that we do not deserve, coming in a way we would never have expected because of what he has done for us. In fact, Paul says in Philippians 4, God will meet all of your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. It's not only something in the past, this is something going on right now to this very moment. And that's why Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 that with God it's not yes or no, that with God it's always yes, and therefore we can be sure that every promise God has ever made to his people, they are all now yes to us in Christ Jesus. So we just respond and say, let it be done. In fact, it says God has put his Spirit in us to guarantee to us that we're going to get this inheritance, that we're going to get every one of those promises. Remember, we said in session 1 that there may be 7,000 separate promise statements in the Bible. Well, they are all yes to us in Christ Jesus. And that's because those thousands of promises belong exclusively to Jesus Christ. They are all summed up in him. They are all about him. They are all embodied in him. They are all purchased by him. They are all inherited by him. They are all enriched in him. They're all guaranteed by him. They're all fulfilled in him. They're all applied to us by him for the purpose of exalting him. In the Father's presence, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant with God, a newly reconstituted covenant. And then Hebrews 8 ends by saying, full of far greater promises. Now, listen carefully. Only in Jesus do those promises ever become ours. The promises of God were closed up into him so that they could be opened up unto us with infinite possibilities because he has already entered into them. The promises define the scope of our hope concerning his reign and his impact on us in our churches, in our communities, in our nations right now. That's why ultimately Christ in himself becomes the final and fullest answer to all prayers that claim those promises. We serve a generous Father who has welcomed us to explore and share in what Ephesians calls the unsearchable riches in Christ Jesus. Having given us his Son on the cross, we can be sure the Father will not withhold any good thing from us, but with Christ will freely give us all things, it says in Romans 8. So we can boldly say, because Christ goes before us, he invites us into all of heaven's resources, magnificent, undefiled, never fading, laid before us in Christ himself, who, as a result, becomes our highest treasure. Thus, Christ is for us the source of new beginnings day after day. Thus, Christ possesses nothing that he has not fully put to our benefit right now. You know, C.S. Lewis put it this way: Christ not only offers us something for nothing, he even offers us everything for nothing. Ephesians says, the Father has blessed us in the heavenly realms with every spiritual blessing in Christ. It goes on and says, God has raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace expressed in his kindness to us in Christ Jesus. And then in chapter 3 it says that we need to grasp how high and wide and long and deep is the love of Christ. Let me conclude by illustrating it this way. As I told you, I used to live in Madison, Wisconsin. It's built on 3 lakes, and being Wisconsin, those lakes freeze over every winter, and you can see hundreds of ice fishermen out there. They go out and sit on their little stools, they cut a hole in the ice, and many of them are able to catch fish no matter how cold it may be. Now, this is a story of 2 ice fishermen. One carved a hole about the size of a minnow, because that's all he thought might be under there, just enough to feed him for his next meal. But the other ice fisherman cut a hole the size of a whale because he had the sense that there was a whale underneath that ice somewhere, and he was going to catch him, and he wanted a hole big enough so he could bring him in and then not just have him for one meal, but have him to share with the whole town. In a sense, when we talk about Jesus going into the promises to make them ours, we need to think about God working in our lives every day with a whale-sized vision about what he wants to do, because Jesus has given us whale-sized promises.